November 8, 1971. Record stores across America receive a peculiar album shipment. The cover shows an old man carrying sticks, framed against a demolished building. There's no band name, no album title, just 4 mysterious symbols printed on the inner sleeve. Atlantic Records executives are furious. Radio programmers are confused. Music critics, already hostile toward the band, are calling it professional suicide. But the 4 men who made this album, Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham, don't care. They've spent the last year being called a hype band by the press. Their previous album, Led Zeppelin IV, was dismissed as a disappointment despite going platinum. So they made a statement, let the music speak for itself. Within 1 week, the untitled album hits #1 in the UK. In America, it climbs to #2 and stays in the top 40 for 6 months. To date, it has sold 37 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums in history. But behind this triumph lies a story of creative battles, mixing disasters, freezing recording sessions in a supposedly haunted mansion, and an engineer who nearly lost his job after botching the entire album's mix in Los Angeles during an earthquake. This is the story of Led Zeppelin IV. The album that defined hard rock, launched 1,000 covers of its most famous song, and became the foundation for hip-hop sampling decades later. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Led Zeppelin's. To understand Led Zeppelin IV, you have to understand the war between Led Zeppelin and music critics. From their 1969 debut, Led Zeppelin had been savaged by the rock press. Rolling Stone, Village Voice, Cream, the tastemakers of the era dismissed them as loud, derivative, and artistically bankrupt. Their first album was called A Consolidation of Every Heavy, Gross, and Vulgar Sound by one critic. Yet audiences couldn't get enough. By 1970, Led Zeppelin were selling out arenas across America and moving millions of albums. Then came Led Zeppelin III in October 1970. After 2 albums of blues-heavy hard rock, Page and Plant had written more acoustic, folk-influenced material. The album featured songs like Gallows Pole and That's the Way, gentler, more introspective tracks. Critics and fans alike were confused. Where were the crushing riffs? The album still went platinum, but the reviews were lukewarm at best. The press called it unfocused. Some fans felt betrayed. Jimmy Page was stung. He later recalled, "After all we had accomplished, the press was still calling us a hype." The band made a decision. Their 4th album would have no title, no band name on the cover, no promotional photographs, just the music. Atlantic Records was horrified. Page later said a press agent told him it would be professional suicide to release an album with no identifying information after a year away from touring. But the band refused to hand over the master tapes until Atlantic agreed. Page's logic was simple. We just happened to have a lot of faith in what we were doing. October 1970. Page and Plant returned to BRON-YR-AUR, a remote 18th century cottage in the mountains of Snowdonia, Wales. It's the same place where they'd written much of Led Zeppelin III. With no electricity and only a fireplace for heat, they sit with acoustic guitars and begin sketching new songs. Among the fragments, early versions of Misty Mountain Hop, The Battle of Evermore, and the opening passages of what would become Stairway to Heaven. Page later described the creative process. "I had the idea of something that would keep building and building, with different sections, verse, link into solo, the final part, something that would keep unraveling in layers." But testimony from a 2016 plagiarism trial revealed that much of Stairway to Heaven was actually written later at Headley, Grange. Page testified under oath that he first played the opening for his bandmates at the Hampshire mansion, not in Wales. Regardless of where it began, by December 1970, Led Zeppelin had enough material to start recording. December 5, 1970. Recording begins at Island Studios on Basing Street in London. The band tracks Black Dog, but Page wants something different. He wants the freedom to experiment without watching the clock. They had briefly considered recording at Mick Jagger's home, Stargroves, but decided it was too expensive. Instead, they returned to Headley Grange, a dilapidated Victorian mansion in Hampshire that they'd used for parts of Led Zeppelin IV. Built in 1795 as a workhouse for the poor and infirm, Headley Grange had become a popular recording and rehearsal space for rock bands. Fleetwood Mac and Genesis had used it. The house was imposing, 3 stories of stone with huge drafty rooms and terrible heating. When Led Zeppelin arrived in January 1971, winter had turned the house into a frozen tomb. We all ran in when we arrived in a mad scramble to get the driest rooms. Bassist John Paul Jones told biographer Mick Wall, "Jimmy Page loved it. The rest of us moaned about being cold, but Jimmy was more concerned with creepy noises or flying fucking furniture," engineer Andy Johns recalled. The Rolling Stones mobile recording studio, a truck-based recording unit, the first of its kind in Europe, was parked outside. John set up microphones throughout the drawing room, ran cables through windows, and started tracking. Page explained the philosophy. "We needed the sort of facilities where we could have a cup of tea and wander around the garden and go in and do what we had to do. The reason we went there was to have a live-in situation where you're writing and really living the music. But the cold was brutal. The band kept a fire roaring constantly. It was beside this fire that Plant would write the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven." The sessions at Headley Grange produced some of rock's most iconic tracks, often by accident. One day the band was struggling with 4 Sticks, a complex song with shifting time signatures that was proving nearly impossible to play. Frustration mounted. John Bonham, annoyed, started pounding out the intro to Little Richard's 1957 hit, Keep a Knockin'. Jimmy Page immediately responded with a guitar riff. Robert Plant joined in, improvising vocals. Within 30 minutes, they had the bones of rock and roll. "It was a spontaneous combustion," Page said. Bonham played the beginning of Little Richard's Keep a Knockin', with the tape still running, and I just started doing part of the riff. It actually ground to a halt after about 12 bars, but it was enough to know that there was something there. Rolling Stones pianist Ian Stewart, who was working as engineer on the mobile studio, added piano to the track. The song became a live staple and eventually the opening track on many Zeppelin concerts. Black Dog had a different genesis. John Paul Jones wrote the intricate riff on a train, using a notation system his father had taught him. Writing music without manuscript paper, just numbers and note values on the back of a train ticket. Jones had been inspired by Muddy Waters' 1968 album Electric Mud. "I wanted to try an electric blues with a rolling bass part," he explained. "But it couldn't be too simple. I wanted it to turn back on itself. The riff was so complex, alternating between 4/4 and 5/4 time signatures, that even Led Zeppelin struggled to play it. We struggled with the turnaround," Jones admitted, "until Bonham figured out that you just play 4 time as if there's no turnaround." Robert Plant recorded his vocals in just 2 takes, his voice cutting through the complex arrangement to make it, as he put it, from a riff into a piece of music. The song was named after a black Labrador that kept wandering around Headley Grange during the sessions. One evening at Headley Grange, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant sat by the fireplace. Page strummed an acoustic guitar, playing a descending chromatic chord progression he'd been developing. Plant, holding a pencil and paper, felt lyrics flowing through him almost automatically. "I was in a very bad mood," he later testified. "Then all of a sudden my hand was writing out the words. The opening lines emerged. There's a lady who's sure all that glitters is gold, and she's buying a stairway to heaven." A huge percentage of the lyrics were written there and then, Page recalled. Jimmy and I just sat by the fire. It was a remarkable setting, Plant added. The song was built in distinct sections, beginning with exposed acoustic guitar and recorders, played by John Paul Jones, building through electric passages, and climaxing with Page's now legendary guitar solo. Page returned to Island Studios specifically to record that solo. He was playing for half an hour and did 7 or 8 takes, engineer Andy Johns remembered. He hadn't quite got it sussed. I was starting to get a bit paranoid and he said, No, you're making me paranoid. Eventually Page nailed it. The solo would later be voted the greatest guitar solo of all time by Guitar World magazine readers in 2009. Carlos Santana, who heard an early version, asked to play on the track. In exchange, Plant contributed vocals to Santana's Supernatural album. Though accounts vary, Santana's guitar work added subtle texture to the final recording. When Led Zeppelin first performed Stairway to Heaven live in Belfast on March 5, 1971, 8 months before the album's release, the audience sat in confused silence. Nobody knew what to make of the 8-minute epic. Within 2 years, it would become the most requested song in FM radio history. John Bonham's drum sound on Led Zeppelin IV became legendary, particularly on the album's closing track, When the Levee Breaks, a reworking of a 1929 blues song by Memphis Minnie and Kansas Joe McCoy about the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. The story of how that drum sound was captured has become part of rock mythology. Bonham had ordered a new Ludwig drum kit, which was delivered to Headley Grange and set up in the entrance hall, a massive 3-story space with a stone stairwell. When Bonham tested the kit, Page heard something extraordinary. The sound was huge because the hall was so cavernous, Page told journalist Brad Talinsky. Engineer Andy Johns had an idea. One night Zeppelin were all going down the boozer and I said, "You guys bugger off, but Bonzo, you stay behind because I've got an idea." Johns took Bonham's kit and placed it at the bottom of the stairwell. Then he hung 2 Beyerdynamic M160 microphones up on the first floor landing, pointing down at the kit. When Bonham started playing, the sound was massive. The natural reverb of the stone stairwell captured every nuance and amplified it into something thunderous. I remember playing it back in the Stones' mobile truck and thinking, Bonzo's gotta fucking like this, Johns recalled. The drum sound was quite spectacular. Bonham's response was characteristically concise. "Oh yeah, that's more fucking like it." Johns compressed the signal using Helios F760 compressors in the mobile studio, then ran it through Jimmy Page's Binson Echo unit. The result was one of the most sampled drum breaks in music history, used over 200 times by artists ranging from Beastie Boys' Rhymin' and Stealin' to Eminem's Kim to Beyoncé's Don't Hurt Yourself. Bonham rarely discussed technical details. He and Johns had their own language. "I never had Bonzo turn round to me and say, 'Oh, that's a great drum sound, Andy,'" Johns remembered. "He'd just say, 'There's not enough fudge on the bass drum.'" That was his word, and I knew exactly what he meant by fudge. By February 1971, the basic tracks were complete. Led Zeppelin returned to Island Studios in London for overdubs. Then came time to mix the album. Andy Johns suggested they mix at Sunset Sound Recorders in Los Angeles, a legendary studio where the Beach Boys and Joni Mitchell had recorded. Johns had mixed successful albums there before and believed it would give Led Zeppelin's music that California polish. Jimmy Page, Andy Johns, and manager Peter Grant flew to Los Angeles. They had barely arrived when the February 9, 1971 San Fernando earthquake struck, a 6.6 magnitude quake that killed 64 people. "We got there just after a big earthquake had struck, and we were running around like maniacs," Johns recalled. When they started mixing, aftershocks continued. The tapes began rolling, and sure enough there was an aftershock. Totally coincidental, of course, but Jimmy was convinced it was the power of the music. Peter Grant was terrified, lying in bed clutching the sides. They pushed through and mixed the entire album. When they returned to London a week later for playback at Olympic Studios, disaster struck. "I put the tape on and the first song goes by and sounds bloody awful," Johns admitted. "Then the second one comes along and that's really horrid too. Pagey should have fired me at that point." The problem, Sunset Sound had changed their monitoring system since Johns' last visit. The new monitors had given them a completely false representation of the sound. Everything was muddy, lacking high-end. Page was furious. He later said, "Basically, Andy Johns should be hung, drawn and quartered for the fiascos he's played." The band flew Johns back to Island Studios. They remixed the entire album, except for one track. When the Levee Breaks somehow sounded perfect, that mix survived. The mixing disaster delayed the album's release from April to November 1971. It also marked the last time Andy Johns would work with Led Zeppelin during this era, though he'd return for Physical Graffiti. With the album finally mixed, a new battle emerged: the packaging. Jimmy Page's vision was uncompromising. No title, no band name, no information, just 4 symbols, one for each band member, printed on the inner sleeve and record label. Page designed his own symbol, a mysterious character that fans would later interpret as Zoso, though Page never publicly explained its meaning. John Paul Jones chose a symbol representing confidence and competence. John Bonham selected 3 interlocking circles. Robert Plant chose a feather inside a circle, representing a feather of Ma'at, the Egyptian goddess of truth and fairness. The album cover featured a photograph that Plant had found in an antique shop in Reading, Berkshire, an image of an elderly man carrying a bundle of sticks on his back. Research in 2023 revealed the photograph was taken by Ernest Howard Farmer in 1892 and showed a man named Lot Long, who was 69 years old at the time. The image was affixed to a demolished building's wall for the photograph. The inner gatefold featured an illustration called The Hermit, reminiscent of the tarot card. Atlantic Records fought Page every step of the way. The label insisted buyers needed to know who made the album. How would record stores stock it? How would radio stations play it? The band refused to compromise. They held the master tapes hostage until Atlantic relented. In a final act of defiance, Page arranged for the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven to be printed on the inner sleeve in a custom typeface he discovered in a 19th century art magazine called Studio. Atlantic finally agreed, but insisted on teaser advertisements showing just the 4 symbols. November 8, 1971, the untitled album arrives in stores. The UK music press initially didn't know what to make of it, but this time something was different. Rolling Stone, which had been particularly vicious toward Led Zeppelin, assigned the review to Lenny Kaye, a musician himself who would later play guitar for Patti Smith. Kaye praised the album's sheer variety and called it the band's most consistently good album yet. Even critics who had reservations found things to appreciate. The album was described as having low-keyed and tasteful subtlety, not words usually associated with Led Zeppelin. Commercially, the album was unstoppable. It entered the UK chart at number 10, then hit number 1 the following week. In America, it peaked at number 2. Kept from the top spot by Sly and the Family Stones, There's a Riot Going On and Carole King's Tapestry. But Stairway to Heaven changed everything. Though never released as a single, the band steadfastly refused, wanting people to buy the full album. It became the most played song in FM radio history. By the late 1970s, some stations were playing it multiple times per day. The album never left the charts. It spent 90 weeks on the UK chart and remained in the top 40 in America for 6 months. By 1975, Led Zeppelin IV had sold 23 million copies in the United States alone. Global sales would eventually reach 37 million, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time. The influence of Led Zeppelin IV extends far beyond rock music. In 1986, 3 white kids from New York who'd started as a hardcore punk band released their debut album License to Ill. the first rap album to top the Billboard charts. The Beastie Boys, working with producer Rick Rubin, had fallen in love with Led Zeppelin. The opening track, Rhymin' and Stealin', sampled John Bonham's drum intro from When the Levee Breaks. Suddenly, one of rock's heaviest grooves became the foundation for hip-hop's breakthrough crossover album. The sampling explosion had begun. Over the next 3 decades, When the Levee Breaks would be sampled over 200 times by Eminem, Björk, Beyoncé, and countless others. Black Dog and Stairway to Heaven were sampled dozens of times each. When the Levee Breaks became especially important to hip-hop producers. The combination of Bonham's power and the natural reverb captured at Headley Grange created a sound that translated perfectly to the requirements of sampling culture: thick, punchy, and unmistakable. In rock music, the album's influence was equally profound. Every band that came after Led Zeppelin IV had to contend with Stairway to Heaven. The song became both an aspiration and a burden. Guitar stores eventually posted signs saying, "No Stairway to Heaven," because aspiring guitarists played the opening so constantly. Robert Plant himself developed a complicated relationship with the song. "I'd break out in hives if I had to sing it every show," he told the Los Angeles Times in 1988. "If you absolutely hated Stairway to Heaven, nobody can blame you for that because it was so pompous." But Plant's ambivalence couldn't diminish the song's cultural power. In 1999, the Recording Academy inducted Led Zeppelin IV into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked it number 66 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, later revised to number 58 in 2020. Classic Rock magazine ranked it as the greatest Led Zeppelin album and one of the greatest rock albums ever made. The album defined what an epic rock album could be. 8 songs, 42 minutes, no filler. Every track serving a purpose in the album's arc, from the explosive opening of Black Dog to the apocalyptic close of When the Levee Breaks. It proved Jimmy Page's vision, that the music could speak for itself. No title, no explanations, just 4 symbols and the most powerful collection of songs Led Zeppelin ever recorded. The story of Led Zeppelin IV is the story of artists trusting their instincts against all advice. Record executives said releasing an untitled album was suicide. Critics had written them off as derivative hype. The mixing disaster in Los Angeles nearly derailed everything. But Led Zeppelin persevered. They recorded in a freezing, supposedly haunted mansion. They captured lightning in a bottle when Bonham's drums echoed up that stone stairwell. They wrote 8 songs that ranged from crushing hard rock to delicate folk to the 8-minute epic that would become the most played song in radio history. The album that nobody wanted to name became one of the most famous albums ever made. The symbols that were supposed to represent mystery became iconic logos instantly recognizable worldwide. And the band that critics called a hype? They sold 37 million copies of an album with no name, proving that sometimes the music really does speak for itself. When people debate the greatest rock albums ever made, Led Zeppelin IV is always in the conversation. Not because of the hype, not because of the marketing, but because 4 musicians locked themselves in a cold mansion and made something timeless. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories, like Led Zeppelin's, never really end. They just keep echoing, up staircases, through speakers, across generations, reminding us what happens when you let the music speak for itself.